Approximately 200 million acres of genetically modified crops are grown around the world. Where do the products from these genetically modified crops end up? A good bit goes to industrial applications, a considerable amount goes to animal feed, and yet another sizable chunk ends up in our food supply. Food, well, that's something that many of us have an opinion about. It takes neither a rocket scientist nor a food scientist to appreciate that food has a special place in human cultures. We gather with family and friends for dinner, business deals are struck, and international agreements are consummated, all with food close at hand. To share food is to share the sustenance of life itself. So it comes perhaps as no surprise that people have strong feelings about food. But the key word here is feelings. Yes, people have feelings, but what do they know? What is the basis of those feelings? To help us better understand the human dimension of genetically modified foods, Dr. William Hallman agreed to travel out here from Rutgers University for this evening's presentation. We're glad he did. Bill grew up on the outskirts of Philadelphia and attended a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. Initially, he was intrigued by the biology and physiology of sensory receptors and organs. But by the end of his undergraduate years, he had realized that perception, the interaction of mind and the senses, interested him even more. He decided to attend graduate school at the University of South Carolina, where he later earned his PhD in experimental psychology before joining the faculty at Rutgers. At Rutgers, Bill is a professor in the Department of Human Ecology, and he's also director of the Food Policy Institute. When I look at his research, I see a common thread involving the interface of science or technology with that of public perception. Bill is the author of more than 70 articles, book chapters, and reports on public perceptions of risk and risk communication. He is also the principal investigator on a 4-year project funded by the USDA to examine public perceptions of agricultural biotechnology. The title of this evening's presentation is Public Perceptions of Genetically Modified Food. People know not what they eat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Hallman to Oregon State University.
Thanks very much. Good evening. I am Bill Hallman, and I let Dave introduce me as a psychologist. I don't normally tell people that I'm a psychologist because I get one of two reactions. Either no one will talk to me when my presentation is over because they're afraid that I'm learning something about their minds, or they'll get a glass of wine after the talk and will get me into the corner of the room and tell me about all of their relationships, all of their problems, all of the psychotropic drugs that they're on to cure those particular problems, all of the psychosexual side effects of those particular drugs. I want to assure you that I am not a clinical psychologist. I am not the kind of psychologist who is any help to anyone, okay? So what I actually do, I'm an experimental psychologist, I'm a social psychologist. What I do is I study public perceptions of health and environmental risks. And we're going to be talking tonight about public perceptions of agricultural biotechnology. Now, Dave also mentioned, very interestingly, that it's not rocket science. Well, very interestingly, I was traveling in my car a few years ago, tuned to NPR. And you've all heard of NPR, right? Oh, right, this is Oregon. So I'm listening to NPR, and they had a brief piece from a reporter who was commenting on the fact that it's not rocket science, is sort of this way we communicate that something is not very complex or very, very difficult. So the reporter went to Princeton University and talked to a rocket scientist and said, really, how difficult is rocket science? And the response was, well, yeah, there are some complex formulas here, but basically rockets follow basic physical principles, and once you understand them, it's really not that difficult. It's not like it's brain surgery. So the reporter goes to Mount Sinai and talks to a neurophysiologist and says, really, how difficult is neurophysiology? And she replied, well, the structures of the brain are complex, and each person's brain is slightly different, but the basic architecture is the same. And if you're going to do neurosurgery, of course, you need some eye-hand coordination, but once you have some practice and once you know where the basic structures are, it's really not that difficult. It's not like it's psychology. She said, I can't imagine. Psychology is the most difficult thing because each person is an individual. Each person is different, and persuading people or talking to people to change their behaviors is the most difficult thing I can think of. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is not rocket science, not brain surgery. It's more difficult. We're going to be talking about psychology. So with that introduction, I bring you greetings from Rutgers University, the land-grant institution in New Jersey. Yes, indeed, we do have a land grant from the Garden State. I am the director of the Food Policy Institute at Cook College, Rutgers University, and I invite you to visit our website at foodpolicyinstitute.org if you'd like to learn more about the kinds of things that we're involved in beyond GM foods. All right, here we go. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is data from a series of national telephone surveys. Again, this was funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we're going to be talking about a series of national telephone surveys on public perceptions of genetically modified foods in particular. The funding was from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, from the CSREES IFAS program. It's important to note that many of the questions that we asked in our surveys are compatible with those of the Eurobarometer series, which are a series of polls done on European attitudes of biotechnology. And the most recent one was done, I think, in May of 2006. And if you're interested in some comparative data, I can give you the link for that as well. Generally, our national surveys are 1,200 people randomly selected from across the nation. Generally, we have very good response rates. You can read the rest of this. Most of you are probably not interested in the details. You can ask me later about the technical details if you would like. It's also important to note that our 2001 study was replicated in China. There our collaborators were Jikun Huang and Chaiping Zhang and Carl Prey. They're from the Centers for Chinese Agricultural Policy and from Rutgers University. Similar sorts of numbers, although they were face-to-face in China. Samples from 11 coastal cities and 5 provinces, and here they are, in case you ever want to travel to China and see our sites. The 2003 study, which we'll talk about, was also replicated in South Korea, and I have some comparative data that I'll talk about tonight. There, our collaborator was Ho-Min Zhang from the Korean Research Institute for Biotechnology and Bioscience. Similar numbers, again, face-to-face interviews done around the same time as ours. Portions of our 2004 survey were replicated in Germany, and some of the questions were also replicated by the Canadian Biotechnology Secretariat. What this suggests is that we are able to organize a group of researchers around the world to begin to ask the same questions of everybody so that we can get a sense of how everybody feels. Yes, it's important to understand how Americans feel, but guess what? We're not the only important people around. Okay. So the 2004 report, just again to lead into this, we're focusing on information about genetically modified foods. Specifically, what we're asking about is, what do people know? How do they know it? What do they want to know now? How will they find that information? And interestingly, what are they willing to believe? Now, this is probably a good point for me to segue to say that the purpose of my lecture tonight is not to convince you that genetically modified foods are a good thing or a bad thing. My funding comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's not my job to sell more genetically modified foods. My job is to figure out how people think about them, how they feel about them, and to report them back to people like you so that you can be more involved in the debate. About 10 years, almost to the day, 10 years ago, I was standing at a podium in Dusseldorf, Germany, in a similar kind of forum, talking about public perceptions of genetically modified foods. It was a forum organized of different political groups to discuss whether the state of North Rhine-Westphalia should invest state money into the biotechnology industry. It was a very, very political set of talks. There were about 600 people in a large ballroom. It was my first dealings with simultaneous translation, because as you've already probably already guessed, I'm from New Jersey. If I have a cup of coffee, I start to talk faster and faster and faster and faster. I'm going to try and control myself. I'm standing 10 years ago in Dusseldorf with simultaneous translation, and I'm presenting my data. This is data from the late 90s, and It's very political. The person before me basically says that the state of North Rhine-Westphalia should take all the money they're thinking about investing in biotechnology, and they should open barber schools because the economic return would be better if they actually invested the money on hairdressing, teaching people to do nails and things. And this got a tremendous round of applause from many of the anti-GM people in the audience. And similar talks about the fact that there would be economic returns if there was an investment in biotechnology, great rounds of applause from the people who were very pro-GM in the audience. I get up, naive American, and I'm talking about the data from, in fact, New Jersey at that point. And midway through my talk, there is this tremendous round of applause. And I'm thinking to myself, I've just made a horrible mistake. Because I'm an academic, I'm not supposed to take sides on this. Obviously, I've just said something that was politically sensitive to get this round of applause. So I recover and I say, well, I don't really understand if I've said something that is meant, it was construed to be highly political, really that's not my intent, and I would like to present both sides. And I continued on with my talk. When I was finished, I had a beer afterwards with one of my good friends from Germany, and I said, what is it that I said that yielded this round of applause? What was this political statement? And he started laughing. He said, don't you remember what you were saying? I said, yeah. I said, I was going through a slide where I was showing the different responses, people's appreciation or acceptance of different GM products. And I was making the point that people aren't all anti-GM or all pro-GM. It really depends on which product you're talking about. And I had a slide and I was pointing out that people are generally in favor of plant-based GM products, less in favor of animal-based GM products. And the same is true, and I'll show you slides like that. And I finally got to the final piece in my slide, and I said, and so we asked, how would you feel about GM in baby food? And the response was, well, no, but thanks very much. He said, it was translated in such a way that they thought you were done speaking. So I'm going to try and avoid that tonight. I'm going to try to avoid making any political statements, and I'm going to try to avoid confusing you as to when I'm actually done. So don't applaud until you actually see my name come on the last slide. All right, so we're focused on GM information. What do people know? What do they want to know now? And what are they willing to believe? One of the things we're also very interested in is the ability for people to say, I don't know. One of the problems with survey research is, and you'll see this over and over, how you ask the question largely determines the answers you get back, especially with a question where people don't already have a strong opinion. And one of the things that you find when you do public opinion research on this particular issue, and I'll show you, is that lots and lots of people have never thought about this issue. And so they're making up their opinion as you're asking them the questions. And one of the things that pollsters very rarely do is to allow people to say, I don't know, to present that as an option for people. Is it true, false, or don't you know? Because it's much harder to analyze the data that way. Well, we wanted to allow people to say, hell, I don't know. So let's begin. Let's start with familiarity with biotechnology. One of the things I want to point out is that the majority of the population, the majority of the population here in 2004, 56%, say that they have heard or read either nothing at all or not much about biotechnology. The same is true in China. It's a little different in South Korea. The South Koreans actually say that most South Koreans say that they've heard something, they've heard some about biotechnology. And we've had a postdoc working with us who says, yeah, it's in the newspapers all the time, in part because South Korea has a real push to be one of the top 10 biotechnology countries around the world. But remember that number because it'll come back. This is familiarity with biotechnology. This is a different survey. This is the International Food Information Council. Very similar numbers. This is 2005 again. Large percent of the population says that they've heard a little or nothing about biotechnology. We call that convergent validity. Similar, this is Canadian Biotechnology Secretariat data. Similar numbers. Most people are not very familiar or not at all familiar or only somewhat familiar in Canada, the same in the United States. Again, if you look at these numbers, the very familiar column, they're roughly around 10%, a little less than that in Canada. And that comes as a great surprise to people who are involved in the biotech industry, because this is a very controversial subject. It's often in the newspaper. And so when I tell them, most people just don't know much about this, they have a hard time believing it, because they spend their every waking moment thinking about this particular issue. What's very interesting to me is if you go back to this number, which is about 10%, the number of people who say that they're relatively familiar or have heard or read a lot about biotechnology has not in fact dramatically increased in 2 decades. First good study done of public perceptions of biotechnology was done by the Office of Technology Assessment, the ill-fated OTA, which no longer exists. At that point in 1987, 63% had heard or read relatively little or almost nothing. 6% said that they'd heard or read a lot. Not very different from the numbers that we have now. This is self-assessed knowledge. So people saying, I'm not very familiar, I haven't heard or read very much about this. If you ask people, well, how much do you know about biotechnology? Again, most people say nothing or very little. Almost 3/4 say they know nothing or very little. Only 2% say that they know a great deal. This is the Korean numbers. Remember I showed you that most Koreans said that they had heard or read a lot? Most Koreans say, well, they've heard or read a lot, they don't know very much. They've just been exposed to the information. This is US data again. Before this interview, have you ever discussed biotechnology, genetic engineering, or genetic modification with anyone? 2/3 of the population say, no, never, not any time in my entire life have I ever talked about biotechnology with anyone. So what I want to show you, or what I hope to have shown you, is that most people in the United States, and in fact most people around the world, say they have not heard very much about biotechnology, they don't know very much about biotechnology, and they've never talked with anyone about biotechnology. How often have you looked for information about genetically modified foods? 89% say never in my entire life. Where would you go for information about GM food? Not surprisingly, 80% say that they would go to the internet. And about 60% say that Google or Yahoo would give us this particular search engine. This is the number that actually pleases the people in library science when I present this data, until I tell them that people say, yeah, I go to the library because there are computers there and I can access the internet. What about Europe? Similar kinds of numbers. Ever heard about biotechnology or radio on radio or television? Most people say that frequently, occasionally, once or twice, but still 1/3 of the European population says that they've never heard this. And we have this idea that the European population is very, very well informed, and that's why they're anti-GM, largely anti-GM. Ever read newspaper stories about biotechnology? Majority are saying never or only once or twice. Ever talked with anyone about biotechnology? Sort of similar numbers. Most people are saying, no, never in my life. This is from the most recent Eurobarometer. Ever attended a public meeting about biotech? No, most people never. So even in Europe, most people are relatively passive consumers of information about biotechnology, if they're consumers at all. So one of the things we wanted to know is, again, most people are saying they don't know very much about biotechnology. Are they aware that there are foods with GM ingredients in supermarkets now? In 2001, we found that 41% said yes, 32% said no, and about 1/4 said, I don't know. They volunteered that they didn't know the answer to the question. In 2003, we asked the exact same question. There was a bump up in the people who said yes, and in part I think that's due to what had happened in 2000, what had actually been happening in the news at that point. Again, 23% are volunteering that they're not sure. When we ask people the question and say, and present them with the alternatives of yes, no, or unsure, what we find out is 48% say yes, there are foods with GM ingredients in supermarkets. 10% say no. And 40% say, I have no idea what you're talking about. How you ask the question largely determines the kind of answer you get back. What it turns out, and you'll see this again, is that Americans are really good guessers. Have you ever eaten a GM food? Have you all eaten a GM food? How many of you have eaten a GM food? Raise your hands. Okay. The correct answer is you have likely all eaten a GM food. What percentage of processed foods is estimated to contain at least a trace amount of genetically modified product? Take a guess. 20%? 80%. Upwards of 75 to 80%. And that's because the main crops are corn and soybeans, and those form the basis of a lot of processed food products, from thickeners to cornstarch to corn syrup. And so many processed products contain likely at least a little snippet of material from a DNA enhanced product. So the correct answer is you have all eaten a GM food. Only a third of Americans know it. Only a third recognize that there are GM foods already on their plates. So we asked people, all right, those of you who said that there are GM foods on the market, what products are available now? Remember, only a third said, yeah, there are actually products out there. The biggest answer was genetically modified tomatoes. How many of you have eaten a genetically modified tomato in the last year? Okay, put your hands down because none of you have eaten a genetically modified tomato last year. Now, one of the first products to actually hit the market and to get a lot of media attention was the Calgene tomato. It was marketed as the McGregor tomato. I actually tasted one. They brought a crate to Rutgers University. They were okay. And that's one of the reasons that they died. There were also production problems, but it got a lot of media attention. When they were withdrawn from the market several years later, there was a small little snippet of information in the New York Times. So most people think that they're still eating genetically modified tomatoes. And when we talk to consumer groups, one-on-one and focus groups, they're very convinced that the tomatoes that they're buying, the really good ones, the ones that look like they're grown on a vine, that are just really, really perfect, can't be that perfect through anything but the hand of man, essentially. And they're wrong. The correct answers are GM corn and GM soybeans, as I suggested earlier. This one I want you to remember. More than a quarter of the people who said, yes, there are products with GM ingredients, believe that you can purchase genetically modified chicken. You cannot. Although apparently Dave is working on it. There is no genetically modified chicken in the marketplace. And there is GM rice, which is in experimental trials, and we can argue about whether it's actually being produced in China or not. It probably is, but it's not marketed in the United States. So you've not eaten genetically modified rice. What's interesting is, in the comparative data in China, we see very, very similar results. Are GM foods in supermarkets? Here's the data from China. About 55% say yes. Most people say, or many people say that they don't know. Have you eaten a GM food? Most people say that they don't know or no. And we ask, okay, if there are GM products in the marketplace, what have you actually eaten? Well, here are the things that were in the market at the time. Soybean oil, some soy products, and some cottonseed oil. And only 9% say that they've actually eaten these particular products. What do they believe that they're eating? Genetically modified fruits, genetically modified tomatoes. Same things we think we're eating, and they're similarly mistaken. At the time we were actually doing this. Now, what I want to point out is, what I've shown is that most people say that they don't know very much, they haven't heard very much, they've never talked about this, they've never searched for information about the internet, and yet they still continue to answer our questions. What I want to point out is that being uninformed does not stand in the way of having an opinion. Now, that doesn't mean that those opinions aren't valid, or that we shouldn't pay attention to those opinions. We absolutely do. But what it suggests is that the number of people who report approving or disapproving of biotechnology typically exceeds the number of people who say that they know much about it. Again, that doesn't mean that their opinions are invalid, but it suggests that there are lots of people who are forming their opinions without knowing a whole lot about the issues. And that's not strictly true of biotechnology, it's true of lots of other things as well. What I want to point out is that the majority of these opinions, because they're uninformed, are relatively uncrystallized. And what that basically means is that those opinions are not very hard. They're not hardened at this point. They're not well thought through. They're not strongly held. They're subject to change. And they're influenced by the wording of questions. Again, what you actually hear, if you listen to people answering questions about genetically modified foods, they'll actually take a pause at your questions, and they'll think, and they'll say, gee, that's a really interesting question. I've never really thought about that before. That's very different than some of the work that we do on chemicals or electric and magnetic fields, where people have heard of it, they have an opinion, and they're right there with their answers. Boom, boom, boom. Or if you ask a political question, if you do it right, people have an answer already, and their job is to take what they believe and to fit it into one of the response categories that you've presented to them. In this case, it's very clear that many people are making up their minds as you're asking the questions. And what that means is how you're asking the question can influence the response you actually get back, because the opinions they have are not strongly held. So what they actually do is represent impressions. So how do people feel about genetically modified foods? I mentioned earlier that people are much more in favor of plant-based GM foods. This is 2003, 2004, than they are of animal-based foods. And I'll show you that again in a minute. This is the data that you get if you ask the question in a way that most pollsters do, which is, do you approve or disapprove of plant-based GM products? Do you strongly approve? Do you somewhat approve? Do you strongly disapprove? Do you somewhat disapprove? And then they sort of chunk the numbers. These are the numbers you get if you ask it that way. We chose to ask a slightly different way. We asked, basically, how do you feel about the use of genetic modification to create plant-based foods? Do you approve? Do you neither approve nor disapprove? Do you disapprove, or are you unsure? We then took them through a decision tree. If they said they approve, we asked whether they were strong, whether that's strongly or somewhat. Similarly, disapprove, strongly or somewhat. If they said they neither approved nor disapproved, or if they said that they were unsure, we then asked, okay, well, if we forced you to say, do you sort of lean towards approval or disapproval, or are you still really unsure? If you ask it this way, you get a slightly different set of answers. This is what we got in 2004. This is plant-based and animal-based. Similar, exactly the same questions, just replacing plant-based with animal-based. And you see here that more people approve of plant-based than animal-based. But this is the number that I want you to pay attention to. If you allow people to say, I just don't know, that's the response that most people take. If you then subdivide it and say, okay, well, if you approve or disapprove, is that strongly or somewhat? What you find is that in the approval, more people are strongly approving of plant-based than animal-based, and this is the number I want you to pay attention to here. If you disapprove of animal-based GM, you really disapprove. This is then forcing the people in the middle who said they were unsure to say, well, how do you lean? And what I want to show you here is with plant-based, it's almost 50-50 in how people come out. With animal-based, it's much more disapproval. So if you sort of deconstruct this, you get a much more interesting look into how people are actually thinking about this. And the response is, largely, I don't really know enough about this to make an answer. If you put everything together, this is what you get. And if you then assemble all the packages, you can end up basically with the question, do you approve or disapprove, that I showed you in the first spot. Okay. Now, these are the numbers, except these are the same numbers that I showed you just a few minutes ago on approval or disapproval. This is strongly approve, mildly disapprove, strongly disapprove, and I don't know. If you force people to say, do you approve or disapprove? Okay? Again, people are much more approving of plants than animals in the abstract. If you say, in general, do you approve of the use of genetic modification to create new plant-based foods? More people say that they approve than if you pose the same question about animals. All right? What I want to show you here, though, is that if you simply ask in the abstract, you get a very different answer than if you talk about specific products. And what I want you to pay attention to is the difference between this line, which is between strongly approve and mildly approve, the approvals, and the disapprovals, which are these lines. The difference between this line and this line. Okay? These same people, early in our surveys, were saying, I'm not so sure about this. I think I disapprove, in the abstract. If you then say, well, if you could create more nutritious grain with if you could create more nutritious grain using genetic modification, would you approve or disapprove? People say, oh, well, if that's what you mean by genetic modification, well, then I approve. Now, in a way, that's a setup. I told you how you ask the question largely determines the answer. If you provide benefits, if you provide tangible products with tangible benefits, people say, yeah. Hormones like insulin, rice with enhanced vitamin A that could help prevent blindness. People say, well, if that's what you mean by genetic modification, then I approve of that. But this is my favorite one. This is the one that I slipped in. What if you could use genetic modification to create grass that you didn't have to mow so often? And there, even people who said, I don't think I like the idea of GM on plants in the abstract go, well, if that's what you mean, then that's okay. Okay? What I want to show you here, what I'm trying to show you here is, if you ask about genetic modification or biotechnology in the abstract, people are much more likely to say that they're anti. If you provide a particular product with a particular benefit, they're much more pro. The same way, if you were to provide a particular product and mention a particular risk, people will go, well, obviously, if there's a risk, I don't like it. How you present the data, how you ask the question largely determines the answers you get back. And I hope that that's on the test. Same data for China, similar results. Many of the people who are talking about plants in the abstract and not liking it say, oh, more nutritious rice? Sure, I'll have some of that, thank you. This is US data again, willingness to purchase GM foods. How willing would you be to purchase genetically modified products? People are already purchasing genetically modified products, they just don't know it. 9% say very willing, 43% say somewhat willing, somewhat unwilling is about a quarter, and very unwilling is about a quarter. Again, most people are already buying genetically modified foods, they just don't know it. This is a chart that talks about the percentage of the people in our survey who had initially said that they disapproved of plant-based GM technology, in the abstract, who later said, later on in the survey, said that they would actually buy the GM product if it had these particular characteristics. So if a GM product contained less pesticide residues than ordinary food, 44% of the people who initially told us in the survey they disapproved of plant-based GM food said that they would actually buy that product. How you ask the question largely determines the answers you get back. And this one, this is if it were cheaper than ordinary food, these people are liars. Okay? What we actually find in an actual, when GM foods have actually been available and it has been cheaper, people typically purchase it. They just don't say that price matters. It does. We also asked a question about should food products through genetic modification have a special label on them indicating that they are GM. And not surprisingly, if you ask the question in that way, in 2004, 90% said yes. 95% in 2003, 90% in 2001. Does that surprise you? No, because if you ask people, would you like more information about anything, they say yes. Now, we asked this question a little bit differently in the beginning of our 2003 survey. In our 2003 survey, and all of these are available for you to download for free online. They're in PDFs, I invite you to do that. These are your tax dollars at work, so please use them. In our 2003 survey, we actually started with some questions about how people purchase foods and the kinds of things that they were interested in seeing in a package, seeing on a label. We asked people, do you read labels? The majority said yes. They're stinking liars too, because observational studies show that people say they read labels and they don't actually, or not very often. The behavior pattern is once you read the label once, you basically don't read it again unless something happens to the label to indicate that something has changed in general. We then asked the people, okay, those of you who are label readers, is there anything else that you'd like to see on a label that's not there? What percentage of the population said, yes, I would like to see whether the product is genetically modified or not? 90%? Okay. Those of you who are shaking your head, no. are correct. What percentage? Fewer than 1. Fewer than 1% on their own said, yes, I'd like to see genetically modified ingredients on the label. How you ask the question largely determines the answer you get back. Now, one of the things I'm most proud of is after that survey, we got a lot of attention. On the Monsanto website, it says, Rutgers Food Policy Institute study finds fewer than 1% of Americans would like to have food product labels that indicate genetically modified foods. On the Greenpeace website, it says, Food Policy Institute study finds more than 90% of Americans want labels for GM foods. Both of those things are true. They were written in the same report. They're separated by a sentence, but somehow neither had enough room to include both. Okay? So what I'm trying to indicate is you need to be very careful consumers of information that are drawn from surveys like this. And I'm sort of making light of this to drive that point home. So what do people know about regulations? Only about a third of the population correctly believe that GM foods don't require labels. How many of you knew that? Right now, GM foods are not required to be labeled in the United States. Okay, we can talk about the specific regulations that are set up around that. I've written a nice paper about that, which is actually online in the Choices magazine. You can download that for free as well. So what I'm trying to point out to you is that the context for opinion formation around biotechnology is an abstract concept for many people. It's not high on the issue agenda for most people. It's not something about which people have been forced to make personal decisions. Because most people don't realize that genetically modified foods are on the market, and the products that they think are genetically modified are not actually the ones that are genetically modified. People are not walking into the store and picking up a genetically modified product and saying, you know, basically to eat or not to eat. That is the question. Okay? It's different in other countries. The reason this is important is that once people make a personal decision about a product like this, their opinions become much more crystallized. In psychology, we know that once you make a personal decision about something, you'll begin to adjust your attitudes and opinions to support that decision. It turns out we are very cognitively conservative, I guess is a way to put it. We're cognitively lazy. We don't like to change our opinions. We like to stick with what we know. And so what we find is that people will pay attention to confirming information about the opinion that they already hold. They'll discount inconsistent information. And those of you who actually have teenagers in the audience, you know that people will reinterpret disconfirming information to support the decisions that they've already made. We all do this. We rationalize our decisions, and we tune into this particular information that supports those decisions. We tune out the information which does not support, and we create special cases for the information that's disconfirming that we cannot ignore to basically find some way to confirm our position. So, in communicating about GM foods, I argue it's important to find the right starting points. It's very clear that these starting points differ among different audiences. There is no such thing as the public, even though we talk about the public. There are many publics. Marketers know this. Okay, they do market segmentation. They don't market the same way to us old fogies as they do to many of the young people in the audience. It's a different message, a different strategy. So you have to begin with assessments of what people already know, how they know it, and what they want to know. And that's really the rest of the talk here. So what do people know? Well, in our studies, and if you go to the NSF website and look at studies of what people know about science, it's pretty clear that most people have a poor grasp of basic biological, ecological, and environmental concepts. Those of you in this room are a special group of people. What percentage of the American population will graduate college? What percentage of the population has a college degree in the United States? 75%? 50%? It's between 25 and 30%. Okay? Think about how different you are from the people you left behind. Okay? Most people, and many people in this audience probably have a poor grasp of basic biological, ecological, and environmental concepts right now. There will be a test afterward to discover this. Many people also have a poor understanding of how food is grown and produced. Only about half of the people in our national survey said that they had ever heard of traditional crossbreeding methods. Half. And I'm a good psychologist. How you ask the question determines the answer you get back. We tried a number of different ways of describing traditional crossbreeding, down to the mommy bird loves the daddy bird very, very much. And people still don't recognize this. Only 28% said that they'd eaten a crossbred fruit or vegetable. How many of you have eaten a crossbred fruit or vegetable? Please, everybody raise your hand. You're all eating crossbred fruits or vegetables. We just don't recognize it. And it's not that people haven't been introduced to these concepts. Most of you had this in 5th grade. My 5th grader is doing Mendelian genetics right now. What I want to point out is, after you graduate high school, there's absolutely no reason for you to think about that fact ever again. And so most people don't. So should we expect people to know this information? I would argue not. The problem is, when we begin to communicate about genetics, about biotechnology, assuming that people know this, is where we run into trouble. I went to a conference in Davis, California, where a guy got up and literally pounded his shoe on the, or figuratively pounded his shoe on the desk and said, if people just understood that genetically modified foods, that genetic modification is just a faster, more precise way of doing crossbreeding, which we've been doing for thousands of years, there'd be no problem. Okay? That's an argument that potentially would only work for the half of the population that's ever heard of traditional crossbreeding, and it won't even work with them. Okay? So we need to be careful about our starting points. People typically overrate their understanding of science and food production. In our national study, 37% rated their understanding of science as good, very good, or excellent. Only 20% rate their understanding of science as poor. I'm about to show you how wrong they are. 75% rated their understanding of food production as good, very good, or excellent. Only 3% of Americans rate their understanding of food production as poor. 3%. And the really interesting thing about this is that people who live in cities say they know more about food production than people who live in rural areas. Where does food come from? It comes from the grocery store. I know that. So what do people know? Well, part of the issue here, what I'm trying to point out is, not how silly people are, but if people don't know what they don't know, they're unlikely to seek education to fill gaps in what they don't know, in their knowledge. And they're less likely to actually sit still for education. So if you don't know what you don't know, you're in trouble. So one of the things that I'm intrigued by when I ask my students, I teach a course on the politics of environmental issues, I begin to ask people going on the Thanksgiving break, will the apple pie and the turkey that you have during Thanksgiving look and taste the same as that your grandparents had? And the students look at me and say, well, of course it does. The correct answer is no, it doesn't. As a good indication, go back to some of the iconic paintings of Norman Rockwell and look at the turkey on the platter. Okay? So one of the things I wanted to know is, how much do people really know about how the food supply has changed, how the food system has changed? And this is just a quick way of showing you that people really don't have a good grasp on this. This is the 50% line, this red line here. Most people don't really realize that food is less expensive now relative to the cost of living. We pay much less now for food than most of our history. It's much less expensive relative to the rest of our lives. Again, less than 50% say that it tastes better now, less than 50% say it's healthier now, nutritious. But where they do agree is that it has more pesticides, it has a longer shelf life, and it has more preservatives now, which is probably why it lasts longer. This is how people think about the food supply. Yes?
What's the age group?
These are adults 18 and over in the United States who could speak English. So what do people know about food production? I showed you only 3% of the population believes that they have a poor understanding of food production. You'll see the correct answers are starred here. About 3/4 of the population does know that most food in the U.S. is produced, 72% know that most of the food in the U.S. is not produced on small family farms. That's a good thing. Most people do know that farmers in the U.S. work off the farm to supplement their income. Most people know that there's enough food produced in the U.S. to feed all the people in this country. 13% of the population believe that most of the bananas sold in the U.S. are grown in this country. It's unclear. I know it's not Oregon. Majority of the population knows that most of the corn grown in the US is used to feed animals such as cows, but just about 55% know that. 11% believe that peanuts grow on trees. Maybe in Oregon. Here's the one that's most interesting to me. This is almost evenly split between true and false. The sweetener used in most foods comes from sugar cane. The sweetener used in most processed foods in the United States comes from high fructose corn syrup. And much of the population doesn't realize that. All you need to do is to turn to the back of your Coke can. All right, so I showed you earlier that most people said that they've not heard very much, they've not thought very much about genetically modified foods, they've never had a conversation about it, they've never searched for the internet, and yet they still have an opinion about this. Where does the opinion come from? Well, I'm a good psychologist. I want to look at people's first thought or image when we mention the words genetically modified, biotechnology, or genetic engineering. And again, how you ask the question matters a lot. This is the first time they've ever heard these words in our survey, and each person only gets one. What we find is that what you call the technology makes a difference. Genetic modification, that word evokes the largest percentage of negative responses. Biotechnology, that word for the technology, evokes the most thoughts or images related to science. Genetic engineering evokes the most images related to cloning. And what do I mean by negative responses? Things like, ooh, yuck, nasty, Nazi, test tube baby, those kinds of things. Science, images of scientists holding Erlenmeyer flasks like in your textbooks, DNA molecules, those sorts of things. And genetic engineering evokes images related to cloning. The cloning images are often related to Dolly the sheep. And what people say is, genetic engineering, oh yeah, Dolly, Molly, Folly, Jolly, you know that damn sheep. So that is a seminal media event. That's a seminal event that people tend to remember. The important thing here is what you call the technology really matters. In some of the questions that we ask on approval or disapproval, if you simply substitute the word genetic engineering for biotechnology, there's a 10% increase in approval. Same question, different word. The reason I point this out is if you look at the surveys that are done by people who are very pro-GM, what's the word that they use? Biotechnology. If you look at the surveys done by people who are very anti-GM, what's the word that they use? Genetic engineering. That difference alone makes a 10-point spread in exactly the same questions. How you ask the question largely determines the answer you get back. So what do people assume, since they don't know very much? Well, many people start with negative images of biotechnology, and it turns out that our European colleagues report twice the negative images related to biotech as compared to US counterparts, twice as many negative responses. Many of these images are actually related to science fiction, the eggplant that ate Chicago kinds of monster, mutant, nasty. What else do people assume? Many people believe that the will of God or the process of natural selection, has yielded organisms that are good, natural, and which belong together. There's a very strong belief in the balance of nature, that organisms have evolved in such a way that if we play God, if we actually interrupt the DNA sequence, that will somehow lead to an organism that nature basically doesn't know what to deal with. There's a very, very strong belief in this balance of nature, and that it's easy to disrupt it. Many people believe that GM crops are not natural. 54% of the US agrees that even if genetically modified food has advantages, it's basically against nature. Here's this balance of nature. 90% of the US population and 2/3 strongly that the balance of nature can be easily disrupted by human beings. More than half say that we have no business meddling with nature. More than half say that genetically modified food threatens the natural order of things. And about 1/3 say it would be better if we did not know how to do genetic modification at all. How you ask the question determines the answer you get. Many people also believe genetic modification introduces changes into poorly understood complex system. 3/4 believe that nature is so complex it's impossible to know what would happen. People also believe that mankind is fallible and that mistakes are inevitable. 80% agree that humans are not perfect, so serious accidents involving genetically modified foods are bound to happen. About 3/4 believe that GM foods were created because scientists were able to make them, not because the public wanted them. Many people believe that companies put profits over safety and public welfare. Many people believe that the risks of GM warrant strict regulations, but the government has neither the tools nor the motivation to properly regulate. Now, in the same way, when we posed questions where we gave the benefits of biotechnology, people agreed that they approved of the products with those particular benefits. If we actually phrase questions in the way, and these sorts of statements are actually drawn from anti-GM literature, many people will agree with those statements as well. The question is, which is more persuasive? We'll get to that. So what do people know about regulations? Most people don't know that GM products are, in fact, tested for human safety. Fewer than a third believe that GM products are tested to ensure that they're safe for the environment. There's some questions about whether Americans would be willing to purchase GM foods if they were certified safe. And what we actually find is that people would be much more willing to purchase genetically modified foods if the FDA, the USDA, actually weighed in on these sorts of things. What else do people assume? In the United States, many people believe that farming is a noble, a wholesome, and romantic occupation. Lots of people dream of moving to the rural agricultural area, retiring to the countryside. The problem is that they don't like the smell when they get there. Many people believe that farmers would prefer to farm organically, but are forced to use chemical inputs. More than half of our respondents said that most farmers would prefer to farm organically rather than use chemical pesticides and fertilizers. And like pesticides, GM products are seen as an artificial intervention. Many people believe that farmers will adopt GM crops simply because they won't have any choice. So what do people know about the science? We put together a quiz about the genetics and basic concepts with GM food. On average, in 2003, Americans answered 7 questions correctly. In 2004, only 4.5 correct. And the difference is, in 2004, we allowed people to say, I don't know. Remember I said that Americans are good guessers? If you simply ask true or false, Americans do much, much better at guessing the correct answer than if you simply allow them to say, I don't know. This is the data from 2003 versus 2004 in the United States. Point out a couple of these. By eating a GM fruit, a person's genes could also be modified. That is false. 68% knew that that was correct. When we forced them to say true or false, only 46% got that one right when we said, you can say you don't know. Okay? GM animals are always bigger than ordinary animals, 57% versus 37%. This is the one I want to point out. Tomatoes modified with genes from a catfish would probably taste fishy. 60% know that that's not the case versus 42%. And the reason I point this one out, this is an important thing from a psychological perspective. What it suggests is that people believe that a snippet of DNA from a particular organism brings part of the essence of the organism to whatever you're inserting it in. There are other issues of sympathetic magic related to which particular animal you take the snippet of DNA from, which is why if you say, well, we took a snippet of DNA from a cockroach in order to create lycopene in your tomatoes versus we took it from a plant or we took it from a cow, people are not going to eat the cockroach tomato. Okay? They don't understand that it's just a way to turn on particular proteins. Adding the unsure choice actually brings the answers that Americans give in line with European answers. If I had given this lecture in 2003, I'd have been crowing about how much better Americans did on this quiz than Europeans, until my German colleagues pointed out that in Germany they don't do true-false tests, they do essay exams. Americans are used to doing true-false tests, we're just better guessers. Okay? I want to spend a little time talking about media coverage. One of the things that we did for our grant is to work with colleagues from Penn State University and from Rutgers School of Communications, Information, and Library Sciences. And they looked at media coverage related to agricultural biotechnology. What they basically find is that coverage appears to be event-driven, resulting in peaks in coverage in greater issue visibility. So around the Starlink contamination incident, there's this huge jump in media attention and then very little after that. So it's likely that people actually become aware of ag biotech through media coverage of specific peak events, in the same way that we're finding that people are learning about E. coli and recall with this spike in media attention around spinach. The coverage, however, is interesting. It tends to frame the issues of biotechnology either in terms of genius and opportunity, so progress and prospect, or as danger and madness. It's, a runaway technology, it's Pandora's box. And there's no middle ground. It's either one or the other. So the implications of this are that the media coverage tends to be infrequent and around peak events. It's framed as either progress or Pandora, as I suggested. There's a very limited explanation of the science. What we find in looking at newspaper coverage, and even more so television coverage, if you had to learn about biotechnology by reading the newspaper or watching the television, you'd learn no science at all, or very little science. Not enough context. So basically what happens is that consumers are left with a limited understanding of the science. Remember I said, after 5th grade, there's no reason to think about traditional crossbreeding methods. Well, you're not going to see it on television, you're not going to read it in the newspaper, so you're not going to think about it. So readers are basically left with a vague recollection of events and the technology, and few people are therefore left with the ability to separate fact from fiction. So one of the things that we did in 2004, this is one of my favorite pieces, is to ask people whether they had heard of these particular news stories. We split our sample in half to do this. And 8% said yes, they had heard the story that pollen from GM corn was actually shown to kill butterfly larvae in a laboratory. 16% said that they had heard GM crops have been detected in countries where it's not legal to plant them. This is the number I want you to pay attention to. 18% that they had heard the story that a large fast food company used chickens so altered by genetic modification that they can't be called chicken anymore. This is a widely circulated internet rumor involving a very large fast food company that has a kernel as its, I won't name it, but its initials are KFC. And the rumor is that they've genetically modified chickens. One version of the rumor is they've genetically modified chickens so that they don't have any feathers, so that they're easier to process. Now again, I showed that only 3% of Americans say that they have a poor understanding of food production. Any of you who have worked with chickens know that chickens kind of need their feathers. They catch cold very, very easily. So this is not true. This is not true, but 18% of our population says that they have heard it. And further, the big one here is that there have been demonstrations against GM food in European countries. Okay, so these are the numbers of the people who say that they've actually heard this story. We then asked, whether you heard the story or not, now that you've heard it, do you believe it? Do I need to say anything? The point here is that most people do not have a good understanding of science. They don't have a good understanding of food production. And so when false stories are like this come out, people have a difficult time basically separating what's true from what's not. Should we expect people to have the knowledge? I'm not so sure. But it's clear that they don't. So here are my first basis of conclusions. And remember I told you not to clap until I was actually done. There's a little bit more past the conclusions. Americans remain unaware and not very knowledgeable about GM foods. I've shown you that. Many people are still unsure about how they feel. They do report an interest in the topic. Because most Americans have not made up their minds, their opinions are often equivocal. That means that they change. They're open to change. They're highly malleable. They're sensitive to things like question wording, what the technology is called, the organisms involved, the intended purpose of the product, the benefits, the risks, and the descriptions of those potential benefits or risks. I would argue that that's both good and bad news. It suggests that there's still an opportunity to have a dialogue. But because uncrystallized opinions are open to manipulation and most people have little ability to separate fact from fiction, it's unclear how that dialogue will work. Now, one of the things that I hear from the scientists, and I often give lectures to scientific audiences, and they say, well, of course, you've just shown me that people don't know very much about the science of this. Isn't it obvious we need to teach people about the science about this? The problem is that using that kind of expert model of what people need to know as a starting point almost never, ever, ever works. That's sort of the educational deficit model. People don't know something, we'll teach them something, then they'll say, oh, okay, GM foods, let's go bowling. Okay? Doesn't work that way. In part because people are less willing to be educated than they are to have their questions answered. Efforts to educate about the science also behind many of these technologies have had limited success in the past because they tend to overestimate people's level of basic understanding of the science, the level of interest that most people have in the scientific details that underlie these emerging technologies, and their willingness to sit still for discourses about those particular minutiae. Okay? It's the discussion of the minutiae of science which explains why so many of my colleagues dine alone. So what do people want to know if they don't really want to know about the science? When we ask people in open-ended interviews, all right, now we're talking about biotechnology, we're talking about GM foods, what do you really want to know? What they want to know is who's creating the biotech products? Who's involved? Do they really fit the stereotypes of the mad scientists that we sort of have in the popular culture? What they're really asking is, do the people involved in creating biotech products share the same values as I do? What they have in mind for the scientists who are involved in these kinds of production methods are along the lines of George Washington Carver. That's who they want doing biotech. They don't want P.T. Barnum doing biotech. They want to know if the biotech product is a good thing. Does it solve a problem? Why? Why are you creating this? What problem does it solve? What's wrong with what we've already got? And people will ask me, what's the difference between the basic American stand on biotech products, which is sort of we don't really know, we don't really care, and the European standpoint, which seems to be we care. I think one of the differences when we ask people in open-ended interviews, if we present something like a new apple with an enhanced vitamin quantity, people in the United States will say, hey, that's kind of cool. Why not? In Europe, the response is almost universally, what's wrong with the apples we've already got? So what does it solve a problem? What's wrong with what we've got? What are the organisms what organisms are involved here? What else do people want to know? They want to know who's making sure that this is a good thing. Can I trust them to look out for the common good? Would they make the same decisions I would? Do I need to be my own advocate? If I don't trust the people who are involved in regulating these things and making sure it's a good thing, do I need to become involved? Who's watching the watchers in a Seussian sense? What's the potential downside, of course? What are the possible negative consequences? How likely are those consequences? Would I be affected? Are the consequences permanent? Who'd be responsible for these consequences? What I want to point out is, and then people say, tell me about the science. What do we do in communication around biotechnology? Because the communication is put together by scientists, it almost always starts with, what is DNA? And it's not that people are uninterested in that. It's not the first thing that they're interested in. All right, so I am coming down the home stretch here. Can the public reach the right decision? I would argue yes, but it's going to depend on what your definition is of the right decision. I'm pretty sure that public perceptions are unlikely to match expert perceptions of GM crops anytime soon or ever. It's important to note that we all tend to believe that other people share our values. We tend to believe that most people know many of the same things that we do and are naturally interested in the same things we are. We generally overestimate how representative our particular knowledge and opinions are. That's true of everybody. We also tend to believe that given the same sets of facts, other people would come to the same set of conclusions. Now, I want to argue that this is a belief that's strongly held by scientists. Those of you who are training to be scientists, this basically is the scientific method. You lay out your assumptions. You lay out the facts. If you disagree, you go back to the assumptions and the facts. Okay? The belief is also socially reinforced. We tend to choose friends and colleagues who share similar values and interests. We choose friends who do think much the same way that we do. We tend to marry people who don't, but in part we choose friends because they do think like we do, and that's one of the reasons we enjoy our associations with them. So the result of all of this is that we tend to think that everybody does or should think the same way we do. When we find out that not everybody does think like we do, the natural tendency there is to question the competency or the motives of the people who don't agree with us. As a result, it's really easy for the people who work with biotechnology to conclude that when it comes to perceptions of biotechnology, the public is inconsistent and irrational. I would also argue that people who are anti-GM also conclude that given the facts that they put out, that because the scientists don't see it the same way, that they're either bought out by industry, they're incompetent, or they're simply irrational. There's a precise mirror image here. What I want to argue is that people are not irrational. Irrationality implies, in this case, that the public cannot make decisions about the acceptability of biotechnology. What I'm arguing is that the survey data that I have and the survey data that is collected around the world suggests that the public has not made decisions about the acceptability of biotech. It simply really hasn't been very high on their agenda of things to think about. Now, there are several problems with believing that the public is irrational. Several real dangers. The first is that concluding that since the public is irrational, efforts to continue to provide information and education are a waste of time and money. I would argue that at some point there's going to be a product that is going to capture the attention of the American population, and they're going to be looking for education, they're going to be looking for information. If we don't have it available for them, that's going to be the waste of time and money. The second issue, the second problem with concluding that because the public is irrational, they cannot make good decisions about biotechnology, so therefore those of us who are rational, the experts, should make the decisions that are good for the public. And that goes for the scientists as well as for the people who are anti-GM, because after all, they're the rational ones, and anybody who doesn't agree with them is clearly irrational. So these conclusions are dangerous. The first one nearly ensures that the public will not have the tools to make informed decisions, and the second one nearly ensures that the public will become so angry that decisions about the acceptability of the particular perceived risks around GM are actually being made for them. That's my final slide, and now you can applaud. Sir.
During your entire talk, I found myself paying extremely close attention to your role as a scientist. I think you emphasize that quite a bit.
I'm sorry, my role or my rogue?
Your role.
My role.
R-O-L-E.
Thank you, yes.
Your role as a scientist.
Yes.
You emphasized that you were a psychologist.
Yes. Yes.
And throughout, you made a number of remarks to that effect.
Yes.
Which I took very seriously. At the same time, another thought that kept recurring was this one, which probably is not fair, and I hope you.
But you're going to say it anyway.
Well, I can't ask my.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
And that is this not? Isn't your research not simply taxpayer market research? Now, why do I say it? I would like not to say it. I would like to hear from you that your institute, and you yourself,
Yep.
are also engaged in as thorough and as sophisticated research directed upon not the buyers, but the sellers. In other words, we have these huge food corporations.
Yes.
And there are a great many executives and managers. We don't know anything about them.
Yes.
Am I right? We haven't,
I wouldn't say we don't know anything about them.
We haven't done the sophisticated research that you yourself have done in your institute
Yes.
with regard to the buyers. Are you engaged in an equally well-funded, equally thorough, equally sophisticated body of research that is directed upon these people that we want to have information about so that we can know what to expect from them and so that we can control them as well as they control us?
Okay. Again, how you ask the question largely determines the answer I'm able to give to your particular question. The answer is no. We don't get large amounts of taxpayer money to talk to people in industry. We just don't. We apply for it. We don't necessarily get it. In this particular project, we actually did do key informant interviews with people in industry to talk about their perceptions of biotechnology. What's really interesting, so it was actually part of this project. What's really interesting to me is that many people in the food industry know as little about biotechnology as the general public. Many of the people in the food processing industry know as little as the standard American does.
Consequently, it would seem to me that there is something lacking in the idea of objective psychology if it is mainly in the service of the sellers rather than the buyers. In other words, here you are, I accept completely, an objective, nonpartisan, thorough, scientific psychologist. You, however, because of the way in which the culture of the society is organized, you are, in effect, working for the sellers. That is, this information is a rich amount of information that they're getting for nothing.
Okay. Let me respond to that.
And they can use this, they can use every little detail.
Yes.
I was paying attention to that
Good.
as well. Every little detail that you have presented here is something that they can put into their propaganda.
Yes.
Into their selling package.
So let me respond. So I would argue, yeah, that this is very useful marketing information. But I would argue that it's useful marketing information for both sides of the debate. One of the things that I showed earlier was public responses to these issues of the balance of nature and the horribleness of corporations and how bankrupt the regulatory system is. Those are statements that come almost directly out of anti-GM literature. And what I actually show is that those are very effective statements. More Americans are willing to agree to those particular statements than most of the scientific benefit statements that we actually make. If I'm doing market research, I would argue that both sides can use this information equally, and I would also argue that the people who are actually doing the selling have a hell of a lot more money to invest in market research that is niche specific than I'm actually providing for the general population. So, yes, ma'am.
Why is it so difficult to, if you say people don't read labels,
Yes.
why is there such opposition in having the GMO ingredients included on the package?
Okay, a great question. The question is, since people don't read labels, why are companies so opposed to this? It's an interesting question, and for a long-winded response to this, let me do a Google search for Choices Magazine. It's from the American Economics Association. I actually wrote up a very nice piece which explains so some of the genesis and some of the regulation of this. It's the winter of 2005 issue, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. Okay. One of the interesting things is and this is a whole other talk, and if you invite me back some other time, we'll talk about labeling and GM. The basic argument is that because most people don't know very much about GM, they don't know very much about the science, they don't know very much about food biotechnology, and these words of genetic engineering or genetic modification or biotechnology do evoke very negative images. The fear is that if you put genetically modified on a label, people will interpret that as a warning. If you say contains genetically modified or may contain genetically modified ingredients, it's the same as may contain peanuts to somebody who's allergic to it. So the fear is that people will interpret that as a government-mandated warning. And some of the research that we've actually done with focus groups suggests that that may actually be the case. When people actually, interestingly, again, this is a whole other talk, one of the things that we did is we made up cans of corn. We did canned corn. And we took a nationally recognized label and modified it ourselves, modified the ingredients label, presented it to a set of focus groups outside of Philadelphia of varying awareness of GM issues. and basically asked them what their opinion was of the label. And fascinatingly, until we pointed out that it said genetically modified, nobody noticed it on the label. And it didn't really depend on where we stuck it on the label. People didn't really notice it. Once they did notice it, they said, I would never buy this product. And it didn't matter, interestingly enough. I showed you the data here, and it sort of illustrates the difference between what people say they'll do in a survey and what they'll actually do, or what they'll say to you face-to-face in a market situation. We said, one of the things that we tested was genetically modified golden kernel corn, genetically modified to reduce the use of pesticides, which, based on our survey data, should have been a really good marketing thing. That was the one that everybody liked. What we actually found was that people rejected that. And the interesting comment was, what? They use pesticides on corn? What the reduction in pesticide actually implied was that there is pesticides in the can. There's just less than there used to be. So it's kind of tricky. The question is, can you create a label to let people know that the product has been genetically modified without scaring the hell out of them?
Well, what's the status in Europe right now?
The status in Europe now is that they are required to have labels over a particular threshold. The interesting thing, I think, so there are basically two approaches. Sorry, let me step back. So because manufacturers in this country are largely afraid that if they put GM on a product, no one will buy it, they refuse to put GM ingredients on the label. They can do so voluntarily. You can do that. But almost nobody does it because they're afraid that if they do it, nobody will buy the product. I've told you that 75 to 80% of processed products probably contain some snippet of GM foods. So we're all eating GM foods without knowing it. I'm not sure that that's consumer choice. On the other hand, in Europe, they took a different strategy. They're basically saying anything that has GM food has to be labeled. And because companies are concerned that if it says GM on the label, no one will buy it, there are no or very few GM products available in European supermarkets. So that's not consumer choice either. And the question is, how do we provide consumer choice, let people know what they're eating, allow consumer sovereignty, without having people jump to conclusions that because it says genetically modified, Satan made it. Okay. Part of the problem, I told you this was a long-winded answer. Part of the problem is it's unclear whose job it is to actually educate people about this. If the answer really is to let people know more about GM, and if it's true, this educational deficit model, which I don't really believe in, that if you simply educated people, they'd sort of get it, which I don't believe. Then whose job is that? Is it the academic's job? Is it our job as academics? Is it the company's job? Is it the USDA's job? Right now, it's nobody's job. Yes, ma'am?
Isn't that kind of like the battle of how they just started labeling foods with trans fats this last January?
Uh-huh.
They fought against it, and then food companies had to go, oh my gosh, and redo their ingredients. I mean,
Right.
Cheez-Its are not the same.
Right.
People see trans
Cheez-Its are not the same. Isn't that sad?
They're not the same. People don't want to eat it for
Yes.
if they're health conflicts.
Yeah, the difference is with trans fats, there's really good scientific evidence that trans fats are not so good for you. And there's some consensus around that. There is no similar scientific consensus that GM foods are bad for you. And so, I've actually heard manufacturers, we've talked to manufacturers who've said, hey, look, I'm not allowed to make claims about my product that they're so beneficial and they're not. I can't make a false claim on my label. And yet, if the government forced me to put GM on the label, it would almost be like false advertising because we know that people will read something into that that's not true, that there's something wrong with the product. Yes, ma'am?
So what if you had to label all food? You had to say, this was made by, this is a sterile hybrid, or this is a, so in fact, in some sense, you get away with it if you do the traditional breeding, you know that came from
Right.
radiated hybrids or whatever. And so you have to label them all.
What if you had to label them all? Well, and let's take it a step further. If we ask people, what else would you like to have on these labels? And I said that fewer than 1% said GM. People do say things like, tell me how much pesticide is in here. Tell me how many bug parts are in here. Tell me whether this was made with Chinese prison labor. Tell me country of origin. So what else do we put on labels? So, I mean, that's sort of an open question. I'm not arguing that we should or shouldn't label GM. My solution, and I should copyright this, is, one of the problems with labeling genetically modified foods we actually found is that the place that people would like to have that information is actually in the ingredients label. People would like it to say genetically modified whole kernel corn, because that's where we look for information. The problem is that the current FDA regulations completely forbids that. There are specific names for products that can be in the ingredients label, and you can't alter those. So you actually have to put it somewhere else.
Is that akin to the milk you can't label things as having BST?
It's a similar sort of thing, because it implies that having BST is a bad thing, and you can't make false claims. You can't in a similar way, you can't say does not contain genetically modified organisms, implying that those things that do are bad. And you can't say does not contain GMO if, in fact, it never contained GMO and there are no comparative products that contain GMO. So it's actually a voluntary regulation. I can send you the link if you'd actually like to read it. It's very interesting. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I was just wondering, the controversy in this issue, does it come from the process by which you make the genetically modified foods, or is it just the concept that it's not natural?
It's all of the above, and it varies for different people. Some people are very tuned into the health consequences. And actually, one of the differences between the Europeans and Americans when we ask similar questions is if we ask Americans in open-ended interviews, all right, so what are your concerns about genetically modified foods? At the top of their list, and almost the only thing on their list is, will it hurt me if I eat it? Is it okay if I serve it to my child, to my baby, to my mother-in-law? Okay. In Europe, they'll say that. In Europe, they'll say the same thing, but they're a bit more sophisticated, and they'll say, what about the environmental consequences? What about the disruption to nature? And some of them will also talk about, well, what about the economic consequences of this? What if we could genetically modify coffee beans and grow them in Florida? What would that do to the economic basis for lots of countries? So in America, it's really, what's it going to do to me? We get that in Europe, but also what will it do to the environment, what will it do to society? It's sort of all of the above. Yeah?
I hope it's not too off topic, but...
if it is, I won't answer it.
Fair enough. Are genetically modified foods capable of being labeled as organic?
No. The question is, can genetically modified foods be labeled as organic? The current organic standards basically essentially say, no, they can't. What's interesting about that is one of the earliest surveys I did on this was I asked people, I basically said, scientists are now able to create, I think it was broccoli. We did this like in '92. Scientists are able to breed broccoli are able to breed strains of broccoli that are able to fight insects using BT, basically. I forget the exact wording. I worked really hard on it. But essentially, it could create its own pesticide. And so you didn't have to put pesticides on the outside. It reduced the use of pesticides. Should that be considered organic? And the majority of our respondents said, oh, well, there's no pesticides. Yes, it should be considered organic. Then I asked them, should that product be sold in a natural food store? And people said, hell no, it's not natural. It may be organic, but it's not natural. So, sort of an interesting thing. There are a couple, yes, ma'am.
In one of your slides about news stories, one of the news stories was that some people have had allergic reactions, and there was a last story that
Yes.
said not true. But I don't think that you can really say that that's not true, because I think allergies have shot up dramatically in the past decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's quite a coincidence. And also,
ever been a study that has proven that these foods don't cause allergic reactions.
Okay.
So I don't think
When I teach statistics, one of the things that I make my students repeat is the mantra, correlation does not imply causation. There is absolutely no evidence that any of the GM foods that are currently on the market cause problems in terms of allergenicity. Even Starlink, which was actually pulled from the market, the big thing about Starlink in corn, and you remember it as the taco shell controversy, was this fear that the quinine protein would actually cause allergic reactions. There were some people who reported allergic reactions. The Centers for Disease Control actually went and investigated, did histological samples of those people, and there basically was no reaction at all. What I want to point out to you is that there is every motivation on the part of the people who are currently involved in producing these products, and again, largely the two big ones are corn and soybeans, to make sure that their products do not cause allergic reactions, because killing people is a very bad marketing strategy. So I think, and the responsible scientists that I talk to say allergenicity is something that we need to be very, very careful about. But right now there's no evidence that any of the products out there right now are causing allergic problems.
But if folks don't know that they're eating GE materials and they happen to have a reaction that seems like an allergic reaction to them, they wouldn't be able to do two together. So it sort of seems to me that it's like a don't look, don't ask, don't find policy with the GE.
We can actually say that about most of the conventional products that we have out there as well. Most people aren't aware of a lot of the crossbred products. And we're actually, it is possible to create a very toxic potato, for example, using traditional crossbreeding. I think that the issue of allergenicity is something that's very serious. I think it's something that people are really looking at. Right now, there's absolutely no evidence that it's causing allergenicity problems. And let me also say that the issue of food allergens is one of the things that my institute actually does a lot of research and education on. I'm much more concerned about the pervasiveness of peanut products actually in peanut oil and other products that people are allergic to. And we're seeing a dramatic increase in nut allergies. And that's one that we do need to pay attention to. Sir? Last question?
The year, when the genetic food was introduced in Europe, the labeling, how did that affect the marketing? Did some products see significant drops because they had to be labeled as GM, or did it not really make that much of a difference?
Okay. The question is, what happened when labels went on GM products in Europe? Basically, there were no GM products in Europe anymore. Australia had a different response. There is GM labeling in Australia. It seems to matter more which product the GM label is on, whether people accept it or reject it or not. My colleague, Craig Cormick, who you must invite into one of these lecture series, points out that, for example, people who subsist on donuts don't care much that their donut may have a GM ingredient in it. People who subsist on carrot juice do care if the carrots are genetically modified. So it may matter which particular product is actually labeled. Somebody mentioned BST. If I were in fact making a lot of money advising companies, and let me say that I make no money advising companies. I've had lots of requests to do that, but I don't do it because I try to be an objective scientist. If I were advising them, I would have said, screwing around with milk is not the place to start. Okay? We have all of these cultural, associations with milk, with nurturing. That's not the one you want to start with. Okay? Start with pork. All right? Nobody has any illusions that pork could be any more dirty or, that's probably where I would have started with a plant product. It's very clear that people make a distinction between beef and beefsteak tomatoes. Okay, so thanks very much. I will answer other questions if you buy me a beer.